I want to go through some information about what we call guidelines for collecting factual information. And these are just a few simple things to keep in mind as you're building surveys or you're trying to figure out how to gather information, demographic information about your participants in studies, how you can go about doing that. So this is actually harder to do than people think that it is because you have in mind what it is that you want to collect and you have a way that makes sense to you. But when you actually get it on paper and somebody else sees it, that's a little bit different. So here's an example. Have you ever used email, news groups, or internet phone? And we're asking them a yes/no question, and if it's yes, the total number of hours used. Well, what we're really trying to find out from here is how many hours that they typically use that, probably during a week, probably during a month. Odds are probably during the week is a safer bet, and then if you're trying to do that for the month, you multiply it. This is confusing because the person doing this doesn't understand what you mean by the total number of hours used. And you're going to end up with some real accuracy issues. First of all, you're going to have people that won't complete it because they don't really understand what it is that you're trying to get at. Secondly, a person's memory is really not good. So the way around that is to do something more like this, where we ask them the question, do you use email? Yes, no. And if yes, the total number of hours that you used it last week. People tend to be able to remember back about a week ahead of time, and that's it. And you're going to lose any level of accuracy beyond that. And then you ask the same question about news groups, the same question about the internet or an internet phone in terms of communication. There's a chance that on this one, you're going to have an anomaly where if people had an unusual week, or is it really, really high or really, really low? But by and large, this ought to be fairly accurate. The other problem that may occur with something like this is if you're trying to look at what is an average window of time and something recent has happened that's not an average window. For example, if you have a snow apocalypse and it throws things off, this is no longer going to be accurate anymore. So even if you have something planned, really look at what is the best way to collect information that gives what we're going to call a measure of central tendency, what tends to occur most of the time. The time period, it depends on the maturity of the respondents and the likelihood they can recall information. That really varies depending on how old the person is. So if I ask you the question, how much TV did you watch last week versus how much I watched yesterday, one of those is okay for the adults. This is okay for an adult. This is okay for a kid. Because an adult tends to be able to recall a time period for a week. Kids, especially kids that are elementary or junior high age, they tend not to be able to remember time periods as well. So you want to ask them something more recently. And again, you're going to run into a problem of what's a normal day? What if yesterday to them was Sunday or Saturday, that's different than yesterday being Thursday. The other thing is how much TV did you watch? This is something that's come up more recently as I'm learning more about how people view information. I still consider watching TV to be watching something like Netflix. But I also understand that this generations have changed. In TV, people don't really watch anymore. They do watch shows, but they watch those on their computer or other devices. So how you word this question relates to who it is that you're talking to as well. So if it's a question like this, at what age did you first try smoking? Again, our memory is not the best thing in the world. We can add something like, how confident are you in the accuracy of the question above? And they can say, well, I tried it when I was 14. And they might say, I'm moderately sure that that's when that occurred. I might say I'm at 16 and I'm only somewhat sure about that. For this kind of, and this is being very specific, but something like smoking, most people are going to be able to remember the first time they tried smoking. There's other things that they may not be as confident about, especially if it's something like, how old were you the first time that you're allowed to stay by yourself at your house as a child? Because that's something that happened for a lot of people a very, very long time ago, that accuracy may not be very good. So, for example, I think that I first stayed by myself when I was in second grade. It may have been third grade, but I'm pretty sure it's one of the two. So I'd be moderately sure about that. And yes, my parents left me by myself when I was in second grade, and that was a period of time when people could do that. You ask them about that now, they say, well, we did that because we had two kids. If something happened to you, we had a backup. Never and always are not great STEM statements. So if we use the idea of marriage and that my spouse speaks to me in a loving voice, what are the odds that this is true on most questions? Never and always. That's probably not really ever going to be the case. So if you set this up like this, what you're going to run into is this and this probably aren't going to occur. People might select that, but the odds of that being true are not very good, but they'll go to that because it's available to them. That doesn't mean that it's not ever useful. It's just it doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way to ask a question. Some questions are very poorly worded. So if I had the phrase, and I was asking you, do you agree with this? The phrase is, I can't stop thinking about how the death occurred. And my responses to that are very rarely, sometimes often, or very often. So if I put very often, that means that I'm saying that very often I can't stop thinking about how the death occurred. That's a very confusing thing for a person to try to conceptualize. So maybe a better way to think about that is, I think about how the death occurred. Rarely, sometimes, often, very often. Don't put it in a situation where you end up with a double negative that they've got to figure out and that you also have to figure out later on. Problems like this, and I mentioned this in one of the other videos, if you use words like IHE, non-allergy nasal obstruction, malaise, those are very confusing. So words like this or identifiers like that are legitimate words, but I'm not sure that those are the best words to use. This means institution of higher education. So instead of saying, what's your participation rate in IHEs, what you really mean is, did you go to college or to university? Do you have experience with non-allergy nasal obstruction? Nobody knows what that is. I mean, you can look it up. Well, do you have a runny nose? That's what that means. Do you have experiences of malaise? That's just a general discomfort, a general uneasiness. So even though we might know what these words are, if you use those kinds of words with people, you're going to shut them down. They won't participate. If you ask questions, you need to be specific in your requests. So if I have the phrase, on average, how many times do you write during the week? Circle 1. So what's wrong with this? Well, write what? Write a grocery list, write a research paper, write an article, provide editing to homework for students. What do you mean by this? You have to be more specific about what we mean. Yes/no questions aren't great either because they're so definitive. Was there much gang violence at your high school? This isn't a yes/no question. We have a yes/no answer. The question is, was there gang violence at your high school? Yes or no. When you put the word much in there, that changes the meaning of these and they actually become useless. So really what we're getting at is, how much gang violence were you aware of at your school? Much, some, very little, almost none, none. And you probably need to be able to put some kind of descriptor that goes in there to help them understand, what do you mean by some? This, how much time do you spend each week using personal email? Problem with this is that one's okay, this one's okay, this one's okay. These are not okay because 1 to 2 hours overlaps with 2 to 3 hours. And this is a very simple thing to miss. So really this ought to be 1 to 2 hours, 3 to 4 hours, and 5 hours or more. Because it confuses a person if they're at the point of they're using 2 hours a week, which one of these do I do? This is such a subtle thing, and it really is very hard to catch. We had another student, a doc student, that she did something like this. She had 4 people looking at her information sheet that she's using to gather demographic data. None of us ever caught it until she'd already completed the study. It obviously, I mean, it didn't prevent her from moving forward, but it was an issue that we should have addressed. The demographics, as I mentioned previously, you want to be very cautious in how you do that. You want to do it in a sparing way. It drags out the survey. It invades people's privacy, and the tendency is you want to put that at the beginning. Don't do it. Put it at the end, because if nothing else, at least you're getting the survey information. If they don't want to do the demographics, that's okay. But you're really a lot better off trying to limit how much you do that. If you can figure out a way to put the demographics somewhere else and somehow connect their demographics to the survey that they are completing, you're a whole lot better off.